The Adventures of Danny Meadow Mouse by Thornton Burgess. Chapter 1. Danny Meadow Mouse is Worried. Danny Meadow Mouse sat on his doorstep with his chin in his hands, and it was very plain to see that Danny had something on his mind. He had only a nod for Jimmy Skunk, and even Peter Rabbit could get no more than a grumpy "Good morning." It wasn't that he had been caught napping the day before by Reddy Fox and nearly made an end of. No, it wasn't that. Danny had learned his lesson, and Reddy would never catch him again. It wasn't that he was all alone, with no one to play with. Danny was rather glad that he was alone. The fact is, Danny Meadow Mouse was worried. Now, worry is one of the worst things in the world, and it didn't seem as if there was anything that Danny Meadow Mouse need worry about. But you know, it is the easiest thing in the world to find something to worry over and make yourself uncomfortable about. And when you make yourself uncomfortable, you are almost sure to make everyone around you equally uncomfortable. It was so with Danny Meadow Mouse. Striped Chipmunk had twice called him Crossbatch that morning, and Johnny Chuck, who had fought Reddy Fox for him the day before, had called him Grumpy. And what do you think was the matter with Danny Meadow Mouse? Why, he was worrying because his tail is short. Yes, sir, that is all that ailed Danny Meadow Mouse that bright morning. You know, some people let their looks make them miserable. They worry because they are homely or freckled or short or tall or thin or stout, all of which is very foolish. And Danny Meadow Mouse was just as foolish in worrying because his tail is short. It is short. It certainly is all of that. Danny never had realized how short until he chanced to meet his cousin, Whitefoot, who lives in the Green Forest. He was very elegantly dressed, but the most imposing thing about him was his long, slim, beautiful tail. Danny had at once become conscious of his own stubby little tail, and he had hardly had pride enough to hold his head up as became an honest Meadow Mouse. Ever since he had been thinking and wondering how his family came to have such short tails. Then he grew envious and began to wish that he could have a long tail like his cousin Whitefoot. He was so busy wishing that he had a long tail that he quite forgot to take care of the tail he did have, and he pretty nearly lost it and his life with it. Old Whitetail the Marsh Hawk spied Danny sitting there moping on his doorstep, and came sailing over the tops of the meadow grasses so softly that he all but caught Danny. If it hadn't been for one of the merry little breezes, Danny would have been caught. And all because he was envious. It's a bad, bad habit. Chapter 2. Danny Meadow Mouse and his short tail. All Danny Meadow Mouse could think about was his short tail. He was so ashamed of it that whenever anyone passed, he crawled out of sight so that they could not see how short his tail is. Instead of playing in the sunshine as he used to do, he sat and sulked. Pretty soon his friends began to pass without stopping. Finally, one day, old Mr. Toad sat down in front of Danny and began to ask questions. "What's the matter?" asked old Mr. Toad. "Nothing," replied Danny Meadow Mouse. "I don't suppose that there really is anything the matter, but what do you think is the matter?" said old Mr. Toad. Danny fidgeted, and old Mr. Toad looked up at the jolly round red Mr. Sun and winked. "Sun is just as bright as ever, isn't it?" he inquired. "Yes," said Danny. "Got plenty to eat and drink, haven't you?" continued Mr. Toad. "Yes," said Danny. "Seems to me that it is a pretty good-looking suit of clothes you're wearing," said Mr. Toad. eyeing Danny critically. "Sunny weather, plenty to eat and drink, and good clothes. Must be you don't know when you're well off, Danny Meadow Mouse." Danny hung his head. Finally, he looked up and caught a kindly twinkle in old Mr. Toad's eyes. "Mr. Toad, how can I get a long tail like my cousin Whitefoot of the Green Forest?" he asked. "So that's what's the matter. Ha ha ha, Danny Meadow Mouse, I'm ashamed of you." "I certainly am ashamed of you," said Mr. Toad. "What good would a long tail do you? Tell me that." For a minute, Danny didn't know just what to say. I'd look so much better if I had a long tail," he ventured. Old Mr. Toad just laughed. "You never saw a meadow mouse with a long tail, did you? Of course not. What a sight it would be! Why, everybody on the Green Meadows would laugh themselves sick at the sight. You see, you need to be slim and trim and handsome to carry a long tail, and then what a nuisance it would be. You would always have to be thinking of your tail and taking care to keep it out of harm's way. Look at me. I'm homely. Some folks might call me ugly to look at, but no one tries to catch me as Farmer Brown's boy does Billy Mink because of his fine coat. No one wants to put me in a cage because of a fine voice. I am satisfied to be just as I am. And if you'll take my advice, Danny Meadow Mouse, you'll be satisfied to be just as you are." "Perhaps you are right," said Danny Meadow Mouse after a little. "I'll try." Chapter 3. Danny Meadow Mouse Plays Hide and Seek. Life is always a game of hide and seek to Danny Meadow Mouse. You see, he is such a fat little fellow that there are a great many other furry-coated people, and almost as many who wear feathers, who would gobble Danny up for breakfast or for dinner if they could. Some of them pretend to be his friends, but Danny always keeps his eyes open when they are around, and always begins to play hide and seek. Peter Rabbit and Jimmy Skunk and Striped Chipmunk and Happy Jack Squirrel are all friends whom he can trust, but he always has a bright twinkling eye open for Reddy Fox and Billy Mink and Shadow the Weasel and old Whitetail the Marsh Hawk, and several more, especially Hooty the Owl at night. Now Danny Meadow Mouse is a stout-hearted little fellow, and when rough Brother North Wind came shouting across the Green Meadows, tearing to pieces the snow clouds and shaking out the snowflakes until they covered the Green Meadows deep, 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 Danny just snuggled down in his warm coat in his snug little house of grass and waited. Danny liked the snow. Yes, sir, Danny Meadow Mouse liked the snow. He just loved to dig in it and make tunnels. Through those tunnels in every direction he could go where he pleased and when he pleased without being seen by anybody. It was great fun. Every little way he made a little round doorway up beside a stiff stalk of grass. Out of this he could peep at the white world, and he could get the fresh cold air. Sometimes, when he was quite sure that no one was around, he would scamper across the top of the snow from one doorway to another, and when he did this, he made the prettiest little footprints. Now Reddy Fox knew all about those doorways and who made them. Reddy was having hard work to get enough to eat this cold weather, and he was hungry most of the time. One morning, as he came tiptoeing softly over the meadows, what should he see just ahead of him but the head of Danny Meadow Mouse popped out of one of those little round doorways. Reddy's mouth watered, and he stole forward more softly than ever. When he got within jumping distance, he drew his stout hind legs under him and made ready to spring. Presto! Danny Meadow Mouse had disappeared. Reddy Fox jumped just the same and began to dig as fast as he could make his paws go. He could smell Danny Meadow Mouse, and that made him almost frantic. All the time, Danny Meadow Mouse was scurrying along one of his little tunnels, and when finally Reddy Fox stopped digging because he was quite out of breath, Danny popped his head out of another little doorway and laughed at Reddy. Of course Reddy saw him, and of course Reddy tried to catch him there and dug frantically just as before. And of course Danny Meadow Mouse wasn't there. After a while, Reddy Fox grew tired of this kind of a game and tried another plan. The next time he saw Danny Meadow Mouse stick his head out, Reddy pretended not to see him. He stretched himself out on the ground and made believe that he was very tired and sleepy. He closed his eyes. Then he opened them just the tiniest bit so that he could see Danny Meadow Mouse and yet seem to be asleep. Danny watched him for a long time. Then he chuckled to himself and dropped out of sight. No sooner was he gone than Reddy Fox stole over close to the little doorway and waited. He'll surely stick his head out again to see if I'm asleep, and then I'll have him, said Reddy to himself. So he waited and waited and waited. By and by he turned his head. There was Danny Meadow Mouse at another little doorway, laughing at him. Chapter 4. Old Granny Fox Tries for Danny Meadow Mouse. Danny Meadow Mouse had not enjoyed anything so much for a long time as he did that game of hide-and-seek. He tickled and chuckled all the afternoon as he thought about it. Of course, Reddy had been it. He had been it all the time, for never once had he caught Danny Meadow Mouse. If he had, well, there wouldn't have been any more stories about Danny Meadow Mouse, because there wouldn't have been any Danny Meadow Mouse anymore. But Danny never let himself think about this. He had enjoyed the game all the more because it had been such a dangerous game. It had been such fun to dive into one of his little round doorways in the snow, run along one of his own little tunnels, and then peep out at another doorway and watch Reddy Fox digging as fast as ever he could at the doorway Danny had just left. Finally, Reddy had given up in disgust and gone off muttering angrily to try to find something else for dinner. Danny had sat up in the snow and watched him go. In his funny little squeaky voice, Danny shouted, "Though Reddy Fox is smart and sly, hi-hum-diddly-dee-o, I'm just as smart and twice as spry, hi-hum-diddly-day-o." That night, Reddy Fox told Granny Fox all about how he had tried to catch Danny Meadow Mouse. Granny listened with her head cocked on one side. When Reddy told how fat Danny Meadow Mouse was, her mouth watered. You see, now that snow covered the green meadows and the green forest, Granny and Reddy Fox had hard work to get enough to eat, and they were hungry most of the time. "I'll go down with you on the meadows tomorrow morning, and then we'll see if Danny Meadow Mouse is as smart as he thinks he is," said Granny Fox. So bright and early the next morning, old Granny Fox and Reddy Fox went down to the meadows where Danny Meadow Mouse lives. Danny had felt in his bones that Reddy would come back, so he was watching, and he saw them as soon as they came out of the green forest. When he saw old Granny Fox, Danny's heart beat a little faster than before, for he knew that Granny Fox is very smart and very wise, and has learned most of the tricks of all the other little meadow and forest people. "This is going to be a more exciting game than the other," said Danny to himself, and scurried down out of sight to see that all his little tunnels were clear, so that he could run fast through them if he had to. Then he peeped out of one of his little doorways, hidden in a clump of tall grass. Old Granny Fox set ready to hunting for Danny's little round doorways, and as fast as he found them, Granny came up and sniffed at each. She knew that she could tell by the smell which one he had been at last. Finally, she came straight towards the bunch of tall grass. Danny ducked down and scurried along one of his little tunnels. He heard Granny Fox sniff at the doorway he had just left. Suddenly, something plunged down through the snow right at his very heels. Danny didn't have to look to know that it was Granny Fox herself, and he squeaked with fright. Chapter 5. What Happened on the Green Meadows? Thick and fast things were happening to Danny Meadow Mouse down on the snow-covered Green Meadows. Rather, they were almost happening. He hadn't minded when Reddy Fox all alone tried to catch him. Indeed, he had made a regular game of hide-and-seek of it, and had enjoyed it immensely. But now it was different. Granny Fox wasn't so easily fooled as Reddy Fox. Just Granny alone would have made the game dangerous for Danny Meadow Mouse, but Reddy was with her, and so Danny had two to look out for, and he got so many frights that it seemed to him as if his heart had moved right up into his mouth and was going to stay there. Yes, sir, that is just how it seemed. Down in his little tunnels underneath the snow, Danny Meadow Mouse felt perfectly safe from Reddy Fox, who would stop and dig frantically at the little round doorway where he had last seen Danny. But old Granny Fox knew all about those little tunnels, and she didn't waste any time digging at the doorways. Instead, she cocked her sharp little ears and listened with all her might. Now Granny Fox has very keen ears, oh, very keen ears, and she heard just what she hoped she would hear. She heard Danny Meadow Mouse running along one of his little tunnels under the snow. Plunge! Old Granny Fox dived right into the snow and right through into the tunnel of Danny Meadow Mouse. Her two black paws actually touched Danny's tail. He was glad then that it was no longer. "Ha!" cried Granny Fox. "I almost got him that time." Then she ran ahead a little way over the snow, listening as before. Plunge into the snow she went again. It was lucky for him that Danny had just turned into another tunnel, for otherwise she would surely have caught him. Granny Fox blew the snow out of her nose. "Next time I'll get him," said she. Now Reddy Fox is quick to learn, especially when it is a way to get something to eat. He watched Granny Fox, and when he understood what she was doing, he made up his mind to have a try himself, for he was afraid that if she caught Danny Meadow Mouse, she would think that he was not big enough to divide. Perhaps that was because Reddy is very selfish himself. So the next time Granny plunged into the snow and missed Danny Meadow Mouse just as before, Reddy rushed in ahead of her, and the minute he heard Danny running down below, he plunged in just as he had seen Granny do. But he didn't take the pains to make sure of just where Danny was, and so of course he didn't come anywhere near him. But he frightened Danny still more and made old Granny Fox lose her temper. Poor Danny Meadow Mouse, he had never been so frightened in all his life. He didn't know which way to turn or where to run, and so he sat still, which, although he didn't know it, was the very best thing he could do. When he sat still, he made no noise, and so of course Granny and Reddy Fox could not tell where he was. Old Granny Fox sat and listened and listened and listened, and wondered where Danny Meadow Mouse was. And down under the snow, Danny Meadow Mouse sat and listened and listened and listened, and wondered where Granny and Reddy Fox were. "Pooh," said Granny Fox after a while, "that Meadow Mouse thinks he can fool me by sitting still. I'll give him a scare." Then she began to plunge into the snow this way and that way, and sure enough, pretty soon she landed so close to Danny Meadow Mouse that one of her claws scratched him. Chapter 6. Danny Meadow Mouse remembers and Reddy Fox forgets. "There he goes," cried old Granny Fox. "Don't let him sit still again." "I hear him," shouted Reddy Fox, and plunged down into the snow just as Granny Fox had done a minute before. But he didn't catch anything, and when he had blown the snow out of his nose and wiped it out of his eyes, he saw Granny Fox dive into the snow with no better luck. "Never mind," said Granny Fox. "As long as we keep him running, we can hear him, and some of these times we'll catch him. Pretty soon he'll get too tired to be so spry, and when he is—" Granny didn't finish, but licked her chops and smacked her lips. Reddy Fox grinned, then licked his chops and smacked his lips. Then once more they took turns diving into the snow. And down underneath, in the little tunnels he had made, Danny Meadow Mouse was running for his life. He was getting tired just as old Granny Fox had said he would. He was almost out of breath. He was sore, and one leg smarted, for in one of her jumps old Granny Fox had so nearly caught him that her claws had torn his pants and scratched him. "Oh dear, if only I had time to think," panted Danny Meadow Mouse. And then he squealed in still greater fright as Reddy Fox crashed down into his tunnel right at his very heels. "I've got to get somewhere. I've got to get somewhere where they can't get at me," he sobbed. And right that very instant he remembered the old fence post. The old fence post lay on the ground and was hollow. Fastened to it were long wires with sharp, cruel barbs. Danny had made a tunnel over to that old fence post the very first day after the snow came, for in that hollow in the old post he had a secret store of seeds. Why hadn't he thought of it before? It must have been because he was too frightened to think, but he remembered now, and he dodged into the tunnel that led to the old fence post, running faster than ever, for though his heart was in his mouth from fear, in his heart was hope, and hope is a wonderful thing. Now old Granny Fox knew all about that old fence post, and she remembered all about those barbed wires fastened to it. Although they were covered with snow, she knew just about where they lay, and just before she reached them she stopped plunging down into the snow. Reddy Fox knew about those wires too, but he was so excited that he forgot all about them. "Stop!" cried old Granny Fox sharply, but Reddy Fox didn't hear, or if he heard, he didn't heed. His sharp ears could hear Danny Meadow Mouse running almost underneath him. Granny Fox could stop if she wanted to, but he was going to have Danny Meadow Mouse for his breakfast. Down into the snow he plunged as hard as ever he could. "Ow, ow, wow, wow, oh dear, oh dear!" That wasn't the voice of Danny Meadow Mouse. Oh my, no, it was the voice of Reddy Fox. Yes, sir, it was the voice of Reddy Fox. He had landed with one of his black paws right on one of those sharp wire barbs, and it did hurt dreadfully. "I never did know a young fox who could get into so much trouble as you can," snapped old Granny Fox. as Reddy hobbled along on 3 legs behind her across the snow-covered green meadows. "It serves you right for forgetting." "Yes'm," said Reddy meekly. And safe in the hollow of the old fence post, Danny Meadow Mouse was dressing the scratch on his leg made by the claws of old Granny Fox. Chapter 7. Old Granny Fox Tries a New Plan. Old Granny Fox kept thinking about Danny Meadow Mouse. She knew that he was fat, and it made her mouth water every time she thought of him. She made up her mind that she must and would have him. She knew that Danny had been very, very much frightened when she and Reddy Fox had tried so hard to catch him by plunging down through the snow into his little tunnels after him, and she felt pretty sure that he wouldn't go far away from the old fence post, in the hollow of which he was snug and safe. Old Granny Fox is very smart. Danny Meadow Mouse won't put his nose out of that old fence post for a day or 2. Then he'll get tired of staying inside all the time, and he'll peep out of one of his little round doorways to see if the way is clear. If he doesn't see any danger, he'll come out and run around on top of the snow to get some of the seeds in the tops of the tall grasses that stick out through the snow. If nothing frightens him, he'll keep going a little farther and a little farther from that old fence post. I must see to it that Danny Meadow Mouse isn't frightened for a few days. So said old Granny Fox to herself as she lay under a hemlock tree, studying how she could best get the next meal. Then she called Reddy Fox to her and forbade him to go down on the meadows until she could tell him he might. Reddy grumbled and mumbled and didn't see why he shouldn't go where he pleased, but he didn't dare disobey. You see, he had a sore foot. He had hurt it on a barbed wire when he was plunging through the snow after Danny Meadow Mouse, and now he had to run on 3 legs. That meant that he must depend upon Granny Fox to help him get enough to eat, so Reddy didn't dare to disobey. It all came out just as Granny Fox had thought it would. Danny Meadow Mouse did get tired of staying in the old fence post. He did peep out first, and then he did run a little way on the snow, and then a little farther and a little farther. But all the time he took great care not to get more than a jump or 2 from one of the little round doorways leading down to his tunnels under the snow. Hidden on the edge of the green forest, Granny Fox watched him. She looked up at the sky, and she knew that it was going to snow again. "That's good," said she. "Tomorrow morning I'll have fat Meadow Mouse for breakfast." And she smiled a hungry smile. The next morning, before jolly round red Mr. Sun was out of bed, old Granny Fox trotted down to the meadows and straight over to where, down under the snow, lay the old fence post. It had snowed again, and all of the little doorways of Danny Meadow Mouse were covered up with soft, fleecy snow. Beside Granny Fox limped Reddy Fox, grumbling to himself. When they reached the place where the old fence post lay buried under the snow, old Granny Fox stretched out as flat as she could. Then she told Reddy to cover her up with the new soft snow. Reddy did as he was told, but all the time he grumbled. "Now you go off to the green forest and keep out of sight," said Granny Fox. "By and by I'll bring you some Meadow Mouse for your breakfast." And Granny Fox chuckled to think how smart she was, and how she was going to catch Danny Meadow Mouse. Chapter 8. Brother North Wind Proves a Friend. Danny Meadow Mouse had seen nothing of old Granny Fox or Reddy Fox for several days. Every morning the first thing he did, even before he had breakfast, was to climb up to one of his little round doorways and peep out over the beautiful white meadows to see if there was any danger near. But every time he did this, Danny used a different doorway. For, said Danny to himself, if anyone should just happen, to see me this morning, they might be waiting just outside my doorway to catch me tomorrow morning. You see, there is a great deal of wisdom in the little head that Danny Meadow Mouse carries on his shoulders. But the first day, and the second day, and the third day, he saw nothing of old Granny Fox or of Reddy Fox, and he began to enjoy running through his tunnels under the snow and scurrying across from one doorway to another on top of the snow, just as he had before the foxes had tried so hard to catch him. But he hadn't forgotten, as Granny Fox hoped he would. No, indeed, Danny Meadow Mouse hadn't forgotten. He was too wise for that. One morning, when he started to climb up to one of his little doorways, he found that it was closed. Yes, sir, it was closed. In fact, there wasn't any doorway. More snow had fallen from the clouds in the night and had covered up every one of the little round doorways of Danny Meadow Mouse. "Ha!" said Danny. "I shall have a busy day, a very busy day, opening all my doorways. I'll eat my breakfast, and then I'll go to work." So Danny Meadow Mouse ate a good breakfast of seeds which he had stored in the hollow in the old fence post buried under the snow, and then he began work on the nearest doorway. It really wasn't work at all, for you see the snow was soft and light, and Danny dearly loved to dig in it. In a few minutes he had made a wee hole through which he could peep up at jolly round Mr. Sun. In a few minutes more he had made it big enough to put his head out. He looked this way and he looked that way. Far, far off, on the top of a tree, he could see old Roughleg the Hawk, but he was so far away that Danny didn't fear him at all. "I don't see anything or anybody to be afraid of," said Danny, and poked his head out a little further. Then he sat and studied everything around him a long, long time. It was a beautiful white world, a very beautiful white world. Everything was so white and pure and beautiful that it didn't seem possible that harm or danger for anyone could even be thought of. But Danny Meadow Mouse learned long ago that things are not always what they seem. And so he sat with just his little head sticking out of his doorway and studied and studied. Just a little way off was a little heap of snow. "I don't remember that," said Danny, "and I don't remember anything that would make that. There isn't any little bush or old log or anything underneath it. Perhaps rough Brother North Wind heaped it up just for fun." But all the time Danny Meadow Mouse kept studying and studying that little heap of snow. Pretty soon he saw rough Brother North Wind coming his way and tossing the snow about as he came. He caught a handful from the top of the little heap of snow that Danny was studying, and when he had passed, Danny's sharp eyes saw something red there. It was just the color of the cloak old Granny Fox wears. "Granny Fox, you can't fool me. "I see you plain as plain can be," shouted Danny Meadow Mouse, and dropped down out of sight, while old Granny Fox shook the snow from her red cloak and, with a snarl of disappointment and anger, slowly started for the Green Forest, where Reddy Fox was waiting for her. Chapter 9. Danny Meadow Mouse is caught at last. Tippy-toppy, tippy-toe, play and frolic in the snow. Now you see me, now you don't. Think you'll catch me, but you won't. Tippy-toppy, tippy-toe, oh, such fun to play in snow. Danny Meadow Mouse sang this, or at least he tried to sing it as he skipped about on the snow that covered the green meadows. But Danny Meadow Mouse had such a little voice, such a funny little squeaky voice, that had you been there you probably would never have guessed that he was singing. He thought he was, though, and was enjoying it just as much as if he had the most beautiful voice in the world. You know, singing is nothing in the world but happiness in the heart making itself heard. Oh yes, Danny Meadow Mouse was happy. Why shouldn't he have been? Hadn't he proved himself smarter than old Granny Fox? That is something to make anyone happy. Some folks may fool Granny Fox once, some may fool her twice, but there are very few who can keep right on fooling her until she gives up in disgust. That is just what Danny Meadow Mouse had done, and he felt very smart, and of course he felt very happy. So Danny sang his little song and skipped about in the moonlight and dodged in and out of his little round doorways, and all the time kept his sharp little eyes open for any sign of Granny Fox or Reddy Fox. But with all his smartness, Danny forgot. Yes, sir, Danny forgot one thing. He forgot to watch up in the sky. He knew that of course old Roughleg the Hawk was asleep, so he had nothing to fear from him, but he never once thought of Hooty the Owl. Dear me, forgetting is a dreadful habit. If nobody ever forgot, there wouldn't be nearly so much trouble in the world. No, indeed, there wouldn't be nearly so much trouble. And Danny Meadow Mouse forgot. He skipped and sang, and was happy as could be, and never once thought to watch up in the sky. Over in the Green Forest, Hooty the Owl had had poor hunting, and he was feeling cross. You see, Hooty was hungry, and hunger is apt to make one feel cross. The longer he hunted, the hungrier and crosser he grew. Suddenly he thought of Danny Meadow Mouse. "I suppose he is asleep somewhere safe and snug under the snow," grumbled Hooty, "but he just might be out for a frolic in the moonlight. I believe I'll go down to the meadows and see." Now Hooty the Owl can fly without making the teeniest weeniest sound. It seems as if he just drifts along through the air like a great shadow. Now he spread his great wings and floated out over the meadows. You know Hooty can see as well at night as most folks can by day, and it was not long before he saw Danny Meadow Mouse skipping about on the snow and dodging in and out of his little round doorways. Hooty's great eyes grew brighter and fiercer. Without a sound, he floated through the moonlight until he was just over Danny Meadow Mouse. Too late, Danny looked up. His little song ended in a tiny squeak of fear, and he started for his nearest little round doorway. Hooty the Owl reached down with his long, cruel claws, and Danny Meadow Mouse was caught at last. Chapter 10. A Strange Ride and How It Ended. Danny Meadow Mouse often had sat watching Skimmer the Swallow sailing around up in the blue, blue sky. He had watched old Mr. Buzzard go up, up, up until he was nothing but a tiny speck, and Danny had wondered how it would seem to be way up above the green meadows and the green forest and look down. It had seemed to him that it must be very wonderful and beautiful. Sometimes he had wished that he had wings and could go up in the air and look down. And now here he was, Danny Meadow Mouse, actually doing that very thing. But Danny could see nothing wonderful or beautiful now. No, indeed. Everything was terrible, for you see, Danny Meadow Mouse wasn't flying himself. He was being carried. Yes, sir, Danny Meadow Mouse was being carried through the air in the cruel claws of Hooty the Owl. And all because Danny had forgotten to watch up in the sky for danger. Poor Danny Meadow Mouse. Hooty's great cruel claws hurt him dreadfully. But it wasn't the pain that was the worst. No, indeed, it wasn't the pain. It was the thought of what would happen when Hooty reached his home in the green forest. For he knew that there Hooty would gobble him up, bones and all. As he flew, Hooty kept chuckling, and Danny Meadow Mouse knew just what those chuckles meant. They meant that Hooty was thinking of the good meal he was going to have. Hanging there in Hooty's great cruel claws, Danny looked down on the snow-covered green mountains he loved so well. They seemed a frightfully long way below him, though really they were not far at all, for Hooty was flying very low. But Danny Meadow Mouse had never in all his life been so high up before, and so it seemed to him that he was way, way up in the sky, and he shut his eyes so as not to see. But he couldn't keep them shut. No, sir, he couldn't keep them shut. He just had to keep opening them. There was the dear old green forest drawing nearer and nearer. It always had looked very beautiful to Danny Meadow Mouse, but now it looked terrible, very terrible indeed, because over in it, in some dark place, was the home of Hooty the Owl. Just ahead of him was the old briar patch where Peter Rabbit lives so safely. Every old bramble in it was covered with snow, and it was very, very beautiful. Really, everything was just as beautiful as ever. The moonlight, the green forest, the snow-covered green meadows, the old briar patch. The only change was in Danny Meadow Mouse himself, and it was all because he had forgotten. Suddenly, Danny began to wriggle and struggle. "Keep still," snapped Hooty the Owl. But Danny only struggled harder than ever. It seemed to him that Hooty wasn't holding him as tightly as at first. He felt one of Hooty's claws slip. It tore his coat and hurt dreadfully, but it slipped. The fact is, Hooty had only grabbed Danny Meadow Mouse by the loose part of his coat, and up in the air he couldn't get hold of Danny any better. Danny kicked, squirmed, and twisted and squirmed and kicked. He felt his coat tear, and of course the skin with it, but he kept right on, for now he was hanging almost free. Hooty had started down now so as to get a better hold. Danny gave one more kick, and then he felt himself falling. Danny Meadow Mouse shut his eyes and held his breath. Down, down, down he fell. It seemed to him that he never would strike the snow-covered meadows. Really, he fell only a very little distance, but it seemed a terrible distance to Danny. He hit something that scratched him, and then plump! He landed in the soft snow right in the very middle of the old briar patch, and the last thing he remembered was hearing the scream of disappointment and rage of Hooty the Owl. Chapter 11. Peter Rabbit Gets a Fright. Peter Rabbit sat in his favorite place in the middle of the dear old briar patch, trying to decide which way he would go on his travels that night. The night before, he had had a narrow escape from old Granny Fox over in the Green Forest. There was nothing to eat around the Smiling Pool, and no one to talk to there any more, and you know that Peter must either eat or ask questions in order to be perfectly happy. No, the Smiling Pool was too dull a place to interest Peter on such a beautiful moonlight night. And Peter had no mind to try his legs against those of old Granny Fox again in the Green Forest. Early that morning, just after Peter had settled down for his morning nap, Tommy Tit the Chickadee had dropped into the dear old briar patch just to be neighborly. Peter was just dozing off when he heard the cheeriest little voice in the world. It was saying, "Dee-dee, chickadee! I see you. Can you see me?" Peter began to smile even before he could get his eyes open and look up. There, right over his head, was Tommy Tit, hanging head down from a nodding old bramble. In a twinkling, he was down on the snow right in front of Peter, and then up in the brambles again, right side up, upside down, here, there, everywhere, never still a minute, and all the time chattering away in the cheeriest little voice in the world. "Dee-dee, chickadee, I'm as happy as can be. Find it much the better way to be happy all the day. Dee-dee, chickadee, everybody's good to me." "Hello, Tommy," said Peter Rabbit. "Where do you come from?" "From Farmer Brown's new orchard up on the hill. It's a fine orchard, Peter Rabbit, a fine orchard. I go there every morning for my breakfast. If the winter lasts long enough, I'll have all the trees cleaned up for Farmer Brown." Peter looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Just what I say," replied Tommy Tit, almost turning a somersault in the air. "There's 1,000,000 eggs of insects on those young peach trees, but I'm clearing them all off as fast as I can. They're mighty fine eating, Peter Rabbit, mighty fine eating." And with that, Tommy Tit had said good-bye and flitted away. Peter was thinking of that young orchard now, as he sat in the moonlight trying to make up his mind where to go. He thought of those young peach trees, and it made his mouth water. It was a long way up to the orchard on the hill, a very long way, and Peter was wondering if it was really safe to go. He had just about made up his mind to try it, for Peter is very, very fond of the bark of young peach trees, when thump! Something dropped out of the sky at his very feet. It startled Peter so that he nearly tumbled over backward, and right at the same instant came the fierce, angry scream of Hooty the Owl. That almost made Peter's heart stop beating, although he knew that Hooty couldn't get him down there in the old briar patch. When Peter got his wits together and his heart didn't go so jumpy, he looked to see what had dropped so close to him out of the sky. His big eyes grew bigger than ever, and he rubbed them to make quite sure that he really saw what he thought he saw. Yes, there was no doubt about it. There at his feet lay Danny Meadow Mouse. Chapter 12. The Old Briar Patch Has a New Tenant. Danny Meadow Mouse slowly opened his eyes, and then closed them again quickly, as if afraid to look around. He could hear someone talking. It was a pleasant voice, not at all like the terrible voice of Hooty the Owl, which was the very last thing that Danny Meadow Mouse could remember. Danny lay still a minute and listened. "Why, Danny Meadow Mouse, where in the world did you drop from?" asked the voice. It sounded like, why, very much like Peter Rabbit speaking. Danny opened his eyes again. It was Peter Rabbit. Where am I?" asked Danny Meadow Mouse in a very weak and small voice. "In the middle of the dear old briar patch with me," replied Peter Rabbit. "But how did you get here? You seem to drop right out of the sky." Danny Meadow Mouse shuddered. Suddenly he remembered everything, how Hooty the Owl had caught him in his great cruel claws and had carried him through the moonlight across the snow-covered green meadows, how he had felt Hooty's claws slip and then had struggled and kicked and twisted and turned until his coat had torn and he had dropped down, down, down until he had landed in the soft snow and knocked all the breath out of his little body. The very last thing he could remember was Hooty's fierce scream of rage and disappointment. Danny shuddered again. Then a new thought came to him. He must get out of sight. Hooty might catch him again. Danny tried to scramble to his feet. "Ooch! Oh!" groaned Danny, and lay still again. "There, there, keep still, Danny Meadow Mouse. There's nothing to be afraid of here," said Peter Rabbit gently. His big eyes filled with tears as he looked at Danny Meadow Mouse, for Danny was all torn and hurt by the cruel claws of Hooty the Owl, and you know Peter has a very tender heart. So Danny lay still, and while Peter Rabbit tried to make him comfortable and dress his hurts, he told Peter all about how he had forgotten to watch up in the sky, and so had been caught by Hooty the Owl, and all about his terrible ride in Hooty's cruel claws. "Oh dear, whatever shall I do now?" he ended. "However shall I get back home to my warm house of grass, my safe little tunnels under the snow, and my little store of seeds in the snug hollow in the old fence post?" Peter Rabbit looked thoughtful. "You can't do it," said he. "You simply cannot do it. It is such a long way for a little fellow like you that it wouldn't be safe to try. If you went at night, Hooty the Owl might catch you again. If you tried in daylight, old Roughleg the Hawk would be almost sure to see you. And night or day, old Granny Fox or Reddy Fox might come snooping around, and if they did, they would be sure to catch you. I tell you what, you stay right here. The dear old briar patch is the safest place in the world. Why, just think. Here you can come out in broad daylight and laugh at Granny and Reddy Fox and at old Roughleg the Hawk just because the good old brambles will keep them out if they try to get you. You can make just as good tunnels under the snow here as you had there, and there are lots and lots of seeds on the ground to eat. You know I don't care for them myself. I'm lonesome sometimes living here all alone. You stay here, and we'll have the old briar patch to ourselves." Danny Meadow Mouse looked at Peter gratefully. "I will, and thank you ever so much, Peter Rabbit," he said. And this is how the dear old briar patch happened to have another tenant.